This is lecture number 1 of a small anthology of lectures titled The Spiritual Hunger of the Modern Child. They were given in 1961 under the auspices of the Institute for the Comparative Study of History, Philosophy and the Sciences, which was overseen by J.G. Bennett. They were published in 1984, and as the introduction says, since that time there has been little significant change in the emotion and intellectual education of children, and the lectures can be said to speak as directly to the difficulties and problems of parents and teachers as they did 23 years ago. Well, now, a further 30 plus years, I think we can say the same. If anything, maybe more so. So this first lecture is an introduction by J.G. Bennett titled The Survey of the Problem. My duty tonight is to introduce the theme of these lectures and offer you a general survey of the problem. I should not, therefore, attempt to answer the question in the subtitle, in our relationship with the young, what must we do to preserve the religious potential that is latent in every child? The speakers who are to come after me will put forward their own answers, and as I am among them, I shall have my own opportunity to speak again. You might suppose that my present task is an easy one, but the truth is that there is as much confusion of thought as to what children really need as to the means of helping them. The problems of modern youth are being discussed everywhere, and sincere and well-meaning people can differ as to the very nature of the problem. It seems to me that a large part of the confusion comes from failing to distinguish between spiritual needs and psychic needs. Also, we often use the word religious with too much emphasis on the outward forms and too little regard for the inner content. When we were choosing the title of this series of lectures, we took the word spiritual in order to make it clear that we were referring to an intangible and almost incommunicable part of our experience, and that we were concerned with content rather than form. We hoped that our speakers would help us to trace the source of our troubles and show us how they can be remedied, rather than analyze the symptoms in the form of social unrest, loss of confidence in the future, and the consequent tendency to overprize immediate and often grossly material satisfactions. I must, therefore, start by explaining what we mean by the word spiritual. Such terms as spiritual needs and spiritual life imply that there is a reality that cannot be reached through our senses and which we cannot grasp with our minds. If there is such a reality, it must be impossible to form any pictures or images of it, and as our thinking depends upon pictures and images, we cannot think about it. Of course, it is also possible to deny a spiritual reality, and to assert that all that exists can be seen and touched, if not directly, at least indirectly with the help of instruments such as science has developed. Such a view amounts in one way or another to materialism, for it holds in effect that there is no reality that is not material. You will believe now that in choosing the word spiritual, we lay down a challenge to those who believe that all real problems can be stated and solved in material terms. You need not agree with us, and we have not asked our speakers if they agree with us. But we do want to make it clear that what we want to examine together is the question whether there really are spiritual as distinct from material needs, and if so, how these needs are to be satisfied. We know well enough that all of us have material needs. Our bodies are material things, and they cannot live without food, shelter, and all that we call the necessities of life. Since spiritual needs cannot be seen and touched, nor even expressed in ordinary language, it is much harder to be sure that there really are such needs and of what they consist. It is just as necessary to distinguish between the spiritual and the psychic as between the spiritual and the material. By psychic, I mean all that concerns our subjective life, our consciousness of what is happening to us and of what we are doing. The psyche is familiar enough in the word psychology. It is sometimes called the mind. But we have learned from Freud and Jung to accept the psyche as only partly conscious, and it is best, therefore, to keep to this word to cover all that we mean when we distinguish mind from body. The psyche of man includes his sensations, emotions, imaginations, and thoughts, both conscious and unconscious. This part of man has its needs, just as the living organism, the body, needs food, water, air, shelter, exercise, and the rest. When we speak of psychic needs, we refer to the various stimulations that are required to maintain the activity and satisfy the desire of our psyche. Without these stimulations, our psyche would languish and lose its powers, even if the body were to remain alive. Psychic needs are as various as the psyche itself. We have emotional needs and desires. We have mental curiosity. We want stimuli for our imagination. We need to express and assert ourselves. All of these and dozens of others create our psychic hunger, and we cannot live unless it is satisfied. But we must not make the mistake of supposing that all our needs are either organic or psychic. You will see what I mean if you recognize that psychic needs can very often be satisfied by experiences that reach us through our senses, whether it is the sight of beauty or simple physical comforts and satisfactions, and so on. And our intellectual needs can also, to some extent, be satisfied by learning more about the world in which we live, through the use of our senses, and through the use of the various instruments by which the power of our senses has been extended so enormously in these last centuries. These kinds of needs and these kinds of satisfactions relate to what I would call the psychic nature of man. I will have to say more about that in order to introduce our subject properly, but for the moment I only want to make the distinction between psychic needs and spiritual needs. Our spiritual needs belong to something that is quite different from our psychic nature. That is, from our capacity for feeling, for desiring, for imagining, for thinking, and so on. They are the needs of the spiritual man, the I, that is more truly ourselves than the psychic apparatus of thought, feeling, and sensation. And yet these spiritual needs are not remote or only important for very special people, those whom we call spiritual people. I want to show you that the spiritual need really begins with something very simple. That is, with the need to belong, the need to have a place, the need that one's life should have a meaning. This meaning does not depend just upon ourselves or just upon our environment, but a meaning which is stable, which we can turn to in all conditions of life. For most people, this is even a meaning that will go beyond life and embrace our existence beyond the death of this body. What is more, this spiritual need to belong, for our life to make sense, cannot be something that is private for each one of us. For obviously, life cannot make sense in isolation from a greater whole. Herein lies another important difference between the spiritual need and the psychic need. Our psychic needs are very personal. It is my own feelings, my own desires, my own curiosity and interest, my own creative abilities, my own need for self-expression that constitute psychic needs. They may even be in conflict with the needs of other people. Very often, in the satisfaction of their psychic needs, people do disregard the needs, both psychic and physical, of other people. But it is not so with the spiritual needs, with the spiritual hunger. The spiritual hunger, I believe, starts really with this necessity for us to belong, to have a place, to feel that we are not isolated, that there is something beyond our own psyche, which is not a stranger to us, which is not outside of us. And this quality in the spiritual need means that it is a need that cannot be satisfied, I was going to say cannot be felt, because I think it is true that it cannot be felt, but it certainly cannot be satisfied except in relation to a whole, in relation to a reality that is more than ourselves. This simple spiritual hunger for life to make sense, which also means the need that each one of us should have for a place in something greater, is only the beginning. It is a kind of first stirring of the spiritual need, but there comes with it another need, and that is that we should understand, to some extent, why we are here and why the world is as it is. We have a spiritual need to know why we should or should not do something, why there is a duty to live one way and not another. When we come to that question, we have clearly reached one of the spiritual needs of children. These questions, why and why should, must be related to something which they can trust, which they believe in, which makes sense for them. If it is not so, the very idea of duty enters among their other psychic activities, the working of their feelings and of their minds. All of these can be trained, can be disciplined, can be conditioned, but this does not bring any satisfaction for the inner need. The inner man still needs the assurance that what we do matters, that there are reasons why we should live this way and not in that way. Out of this who am I and why, what should I do and why, there begins to be a spiritual need for contact with a larger reality. Man at all stages of his development and in every period of history has felt this need to belong, to be able to turn to a greater reality in which he can trust. Moreover, people have always recognized that this need brings with it obligations that may, and indeed usually do, conflict with the impulses of the psyche. When this combination of need and obligation become a factor in the life of an individual, we say that he has a religious sense. Through religion, our private problems cease to be solely human and are brought into relation with the supreme reality that is God. With this, we begin to gain the conviction that there is a reliable answer to all questions of why and wherefore. We begin to recognize the significance of such a phrase as God in whom we live and move and have our being. Such expressions can refer only to the spiritual reality that is beyond the reach of the senses and even beyond the understanding of the mind. I have tried to define for you a distinction that I believe to be real and important for any right understanding of children and their needs. Some of you may not agree that man has a spiritual as distinct from a psychic nature. Others may go further and deny that there is any sense of distinguishing the psychic from the organic. Whether or not we agree about the facts of human nature, I believe that we shall all find it useful to keep our descriptions clear. There are, first, as everyone must agree, organic needs of our animal bodies. Secondly, as most people will admit, there are psychic needs that arise in our thoughts, feelings, and imagination, as well as in the deeper regions of the psyche commonly called the subconscious. Thirdly, some, perhaps most of you, will be ready to accept another reality, that of the spiritual part of our nature. I connect this with the I of man, with his will and with the freedom that is his most precious attribute. The spiritual needs are not the needs of any part of me, but those that concern I, myself. Having made these distinctions, I shall try to state the problem of the spiritual hunger of the modern child, and suggest the question to which we are seeking an answer. The question begins from the moment of conception. How far is the future life influenced by hereditary and by the psychic conditions of the parents when the child is conceived? Evidence is accumulating that suggests that these influences make themselves felt throughout life. But I shall say no more about this at present, as it would lead me into suggesting answers rather than questions. After conception, there are prenatal influences. These affect the body and the psyche in ways that are very evident during the first months after birth. It seems as if the psyche, subject to prenatal disturbances, is deprived of its spiritual needs and enters life with a handicap that only special care will overcome. I only mention conception and gestation to remind you that the spiritual problem may well arise even before the child is born. This we cannot know from any direct evidence, but I believe that much can be learned from the observation of newborn children. I am convinced that we can verify the reality of the spiritual element in our human nature by observing gestures and sounds made by a newborn child. Most of these can be accounted for as organic reflexes, but there are others that strongly suggest that an inner, spiritual awareness is present. At first there is very little awareness arising from sense perception, and the psyche has little or no content in the shape of memories and habits. In the program of the lectures, the words "heaven lies about us in our infancy" are quoted from William Wordsmith's poem, Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood. You may or may not be prepared to admit that there is evidence of a spiritual nature present in children from birth, but you will certainly agree that the child begins to be drawn outwards by the influences of the environment, people and things. From this time onwards, the child begins to show psychic as well as organic needs. These tend to obscure the finer spiritual needs, and the child begins to lose that otherworldly quality that is so touching and so mysterious for all who are sensitive to its presence.